Hello and welcome to my podcast on the apocalypse. My name is Steve. In my previous podcast, I introduced the book Apocalypse, Letter by Letter, a literary analysis of the book of Revelation by Stephen Paul, and I explained that he was my brother-in-law. And in podcast 3, we looked at the symbolism and the appearance of Jesus Christ and how it relates to the letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. In this podcast, we'll begin to dive into the sealed scroll, chapters 4 to 9.5 of the Apocalypse. The information for the next chapters was contained in a letter, a typewritten letter from Stephen Paul in October 1997. Around this time, he began to really dive deep into the grammar and literary devices used in the Apocalypse. First, the terms heaven and kingdom should be defined. In Daniel 7, 9 through 10, the Jews of ancient Israel called the army or strength of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, and it became great against the south and against the east and against the strength. And it was magnified even unto the strength of heaven, and it threw down of the strength and of the stars and trod upon them. In Isaiah 34:5, God said to the prophet, when my sword has drunk its fill in heaven, lo, it shall come down in judgment upon Edom. God was talking about the theocracy. Nota bene, the expression come down. Jesus called his church the kingdom of heaven in Matthew 16, 18 through 19. John calls it the kingdom in chapter 1 of the Apocalypse. In chapter 4 and in many others, he simply calls it heaven. In chapter 7, 9, 12, 13, 19, and 21. Moreover, the kingdom of heaven is in 2 places. In Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 45, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. A stone hewn out of a mountain smashed a statue of various metals, beginning with its feet. Then the stone became a mountain that covered the entire earth. The prophet explained that the stone represented the everlasting kingdom, which the God of heaven would set up. Hence, there is a kingdom of heaven in eternity, and there is the kingdom of heaven on earth. This fact is corroborated in chapter 10 of the Apocalypse, where a mighty angel comes down from heaven into heaven, and also in chapter 12, where a male child is snatched up from heaven into heaven. And in verse 12, that reads, rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. Therefore, unless context indicates otherwise, the term heaven in the Apocalypse means the church. Chapter 4 begins with the phrase, after these things, which means John has just finished noting down Christ's last dictation. He looks up and sees a door standing open in heaven. Then the voice, like a trumpet from chapter 1, commands him, come up hither, and I will show you what must take place after these things. The opening and concluding phrases are the same, meta tauta. The latter alludes to the former, and both allude to Christ's command in verse 19 of chapter 1. From this point on, the book is future history, the future history of the church and of the world, insofar as the world will connect with the church and or affect her destiny. Common sense should see the book will tell about the kingdom of heaven on earth, not in eternity. For as John himself wrote in his first epistle, no one has seen God. Nowhere in the New Testament did any divinely inspired writer even attempt to describe eternity. If any had done so, verily, the comical would have entered a category all alien to him who said, the eye has not seen, nor the ear heard, what awaits those who keep my commandments. Therefore, faith must reject absolutely the view that the Apocalypse is merely a book of parables and consolations. The description of future history, however, does not begin until chapter 6, until after Christ opens the sealed scroll in chapter 5, because something most important must be shown first. John looked through the door and saw that a throne stood in heaven, and upon the throne one seated. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders, clothed in white garments, with golden crowns on their heads. And in front of the throne, there is, as it were, a sea of glass, like crystal. And within the space before the throne and around the throne are four living beings, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living being is like a lion, the second like an ox, the third has a face like that of a man, and the fourth like an eagle flying. Regarding the four living beings, the Greek reads, Kai and Miso to throno, and in the midst of the throne, described in verse 6. This does not mean the four are sitting in God's lap, for heaven's sake. Rather, the throne is not only the seat at the top where God is, but also the rest of it lower down, perhaps something like a dais. Hence, the four living beings are midway on the dais between the top and the bottom of the whole throne, but they are nonetheless together with God on the throne. In a ring around the foot of the throne, but not on it, are the 24 elders, each seated on his own smaller throne. Farthest out is the crystal sea. In chapter 5, verse 11, John wrote that the angels, real ones, surround the throne and the four living beings and the elders. It is thus logical deduction that the angels are between the elders and the crystal sea. What John described is the church as an organization with a hierarchy. He mentioned God first and the four living beings last, even though the four living beings are second in rank, probably because the first and last positions in a sentence or paragraph are the strongest psychologically speaking. Euphemistically speaking, his description was circuitous. Rationally speaking, it was meticulously deliberate. In chapter 5, John's description of those worshiping proceeds from the four living beings to the elders, to the angels, and to the crystal sea. But in chapter 7, it proceeds from the crystal sea to the angels, to the elders, to the four living beings. Likewise, he mentions lightning first, then thunder in chapter 4, but it reverses the order of mention in verse 5 of chapter 8. In both instances, he altered the order of mention for a specific concrete reason. His method came neither of madness nor of the intention to occasion it, but with the desire to demonstrate to the reader that unless God grants a private revelation, faith must reason discursively to find the meaning. It should be no surprise that one of the four living beings has a face like that of a man, for the human face is the symbol of rational thought. Now, many have asserted that the four living beings are the four evangelists. One must bear in mind the apocalypse deals with what is and what must take place after these things. When John received the visions, all of the other evangelists had been dead long since. John himself would die a few years later and be buried in Ephesus. The visions are not about them, but about those to whom the apostles handed down the teachings and the authority given by Christ. If one asserts the four living beings are the four evangelists, then John must be simultaneously both a spectator of the vision and a participant in it. Even worse, two secretaries, Mark and Luke, would be equal in rank to the two apostles, Matthew and John, despite the fact that a definite hierarchy is described. A circuitous approach to the identity of the four living beings must be made. The 24 elders hold lesser positions of spiritual authority in the church, as shown by the fact that each sits on a throne lower down and each wears a gold Stephanos, the crown of a regent or subordinate ruler. In chapter 5, the four living beings and the 24 elders, but not the angels and crystal sea, hold harps and golden bowls full of incense, and they enact worship before God and the Lamb. The term elder is the English translation of presbyteros from the same Greek word as derived the English word priest. The 24 elders then represent the church's priests. Since the clergy comprise two principal groups, and since the four living beings hold higher rank, it logically follows that the four living beings represent the episcopate, the bishops, and cardinals. It is now clear that the clergy hold higher rank in the church than angels do. The crystal sea, which includes me, represents the laity, furthest from the throne and lowest in rank. Chapters 4 and 5 depict one of the apocalypse's chief themes, authority and power. For chapter 5, verse 1, some translations read, Then I saw on the right hand of the one seated on the throne. The Westminster version more clearly more accurately reads, and I saw on the right hand of him who sitteth on the throne. What John wrote is this: Kai eden epi ten dexian tu, kathmeno epi tu thruno. And I saw on the right of the one seated on the throne. If John had intended to write hand, he would have done so, as he did about Christ in chapter 1, verse 16, where he said, and he held in the right hand of him. Chapters 4 and 5, it is most conspicuous that John absented from the text any anthropomorphisms in regard to God the Father. John used the term kathmeno to mean one who has seated or placed himself, not to suggest a human figure in a sitting position. That is why John did not describe a human figure on the throne. Instead, he wrote that the one seated there appeared like jasper and carnelian, which means the colors of jasper and carnelian. This interpretation is corroborated by the very next words, and around the throne was a rainbow like an emerald. The rainbow is not an emerald, but light, and the light is the color of an emerald. John saw God the Father as light, not a solid human shape. The Father is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth, John said in chapter 4, verse 24. In the New Testament, spirit is symbolized most often by light. In verse 6, John wrote, and I saw in the midst of the throne and the four living beings, in the midst of the elders, a lamb standing as it were sacrificed. But in verse 9, the four living beings and the elders sing a new song. Worthy art thou to take the scroll and open its seals, for thou wast sacrificed and didst redeem to God by thy blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and hast made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign upon the earth. Greek terms John used pertain to a creature killed or slaughtered by a priest in worshiping a deity. The term lamb is not a fully accurate translation. Everywhere else in the New Testament, even in John's Gospel, in chapter 129, the Greek word amnos equals lamb is used to mean Christ. But the Greek word in chapter 5 of the Apocalypse, the same in 12 chapters 29 times, is the diminutive to arneon, which means the little lamb. John is telling the reader something important. Jesus Christ as the lamb was sacrificed, but as the little lamb he is, as it were, sacrificed. And that is why the four living beings and the 24 elders sing a new song. Christ's role in the apocalypse is different from his role before his resurrection. His worthiness to open the scroll and break the seals comes not only from the fact that he has conquered, but also from the fact that he is the little lamb. The little lamb is standing between the Father and the living beings, while only the living beings and the elders are enacting, indeed, the context suggests reenacting, some kind of sacrifice to God the Father. Jesus Christ is standing not only in the position of mediator, but also that of both high priest and victim. In verse 5, an elder calls Christ the Lion of Judah, the root of David. This refers to Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10. On that day, the root of Jesse, the Gentiles shall seek out, for his dwelling shall be glorious. The dwelling was the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament. In Exodus 40:33, it reads, Moses could not enter the meeting tent because the cloud settled down on it and the glory of the Lord filled the dwelling. Moses could not enter because God was present and no man could see God face to face and live. Jesus Christ, Son of God and Son of Man, is the real presence, divine and glorified, human, spiritual and corporal, in his dwelling, the church. The little lamb is the Eucharistic Christ and the unbloodied sacrifice of the Mass. At the Last Supper, Jesus for the first time changed bread and wine into his body and blood. Then he declared, now is the ruler of this world cast out. Christ became the lamb sacrificed on the cross in a bloody manner so that he could become the little lamb sacrificed in the Mass in an unbloody manner. Through him, with him, in him, the church militant shall conquer, shall bring the Father's plan to completion. This is why the angels sing in a full voice, Worthy is the little lamb that was sacrificed to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. What else would the angels sing in this context but the sacred number 7? So now you know the most important thing that had to be shown first. By the way, in verse 5, an elder calls Christ the Lion of Judah, because the lion is the symbol of royalty, namely kings. It is also the symbol of the papacy, for the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth. That is why John wrote in chapter 4, the first living being is like a lion. In the next podcast, we'll look at the 4 angels holding something back at the river Euphrates. The book can be found at the Apocalypse letter by letter, and a discount code is provided at the top of the page. May the Lord Jesus Christ bless you and keep you.